I appreciate this has been quite a intense day and a half looking at the issue of responsible sourcing from all different angles. And thank you to those who have kept the faith and continued in the conversation. We know others will join us, and also we know that people are linking in on the YouTube channel as well. So we hope that many of the messages that have come over the last couple of days have helped to focus minds, thoughts and ideas on the discussions as they move forward. Just a reminder, the resourcing project is a 4-year program, and it's really a platform to try and work out where the most fruitful discussions are in encouraging action forwards on responsible sourcing. And it was felt at the end of this first conference, it was worth us really just trying to take a breath, draw some of the strands together and reflect on what we're learning and what maybe some of the key messages moving forwards are. And we're going to have a discussion shortly about where maybe some of the greatest prospects and barriers are to moving this agenda forward. Maybe looking also at seeing, are there any big ideas out there that really could galvanize responses, given the timing urgency of so many of the issues we're facing as societies and as a planet, and also a reflection on what this might mean in terms of taking the resourcing project a little bit further forward. But really, first of all, I'd like to bring Andy Endel back into the conversation, who's been the mastermind or one of the masterminds behind the conference and is part of the core team. Andy, you've been listening intently over the last day and a half. You started it off, so so I hope you're encouraged by some of the messages coming out, and just wonder whether you'd like just to take a few moments on maybe just one or two reflections on what's perhaps emerging that might inform our discussion to come. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much, Peter. And first, I'd like to say it was a pleasure really to see these tremendously deep conversations emerging along so many different topics. Most important through the 4 driver sessions we had on engagement of frontline communities for advocacy and awareness building, for frontrunners and business alliances in making the way to responsible sourcing. And today, most importantly, I think the interplay of policy and industry standards and their role in bringing us forward for responsible sourcing. And last, a quite recent and new discussion on how the financial sector could galvanize kind of the meaningful transition as a new player on the field. And I would like really to take a step back and really pull out some important messages I found tremendously important, and also cross-cutting across these 4 quite diverse things. So let's take a step back and go into a bird's eye view of bring us back at the main idea of the conference and a lot of the issues that have been discussed. So in how far we are actually making progress for implementing responsible sourcing on these various ends of drivers. And we see quite a different level of momentum and progress when looking at, for example, the finance sector compared to what industry standards have been achieved so far. But as one, I think, common thread that was kind of cross-cutting along the different sessions we had, and is the rationale that proactive agency actually is something that is a prerequisite for action. The idea that then when there is a problem, actors come together and resolve and address and to find common solutions that work for everybody. And this has been mentioned in a way that there need to be the right stakeholders on board. We need to have a balanced power distribution of what actors could actually achieve. And for that purpose, we need to have effective governance structures. And these are actually somehow, it seems, the ingredients to really boost actions and initiate change for really the stakeholders to get this kind of ownership and commitment to bring actions on the board. This has been seen in the advocacy and awareness session yesterday, in the sense that we need to proactively connect with frontline communities and treat them as allies rather than see them as adversaries. Yesterday in the Frontliners and Business Alliances session, that it's important who sits actually on governance boards in the alliances, and that frontrunners can play a role in bringing up the standard of what we want to achieve with responsible sourcing and how we want to manage things. And also today in the policy and industry standard sessions, that in order to facilitate this alignment on what is responsible sourcing on the international level, what could it achieve as a benchmark for both industry and policy action, there is a need for dialogue among governments and industry standard setters to make this happen. So really, to bringing this all together, my question would be for the last wrap-up session for the panel in particular, and for the participants chiming in on this, is, given this agency problem, how do we bring in the actors that are not yet convinced, that are not yet in the fold of our RS agenda, responsible sourcing, that don't see the value? And is this kind of agency for a proactive and front-run approach, is this counteractive to bringing players along of the entire value chain? Is it rather creating groups of actors that are left out of the discussion? And if that is so, what are actually the underlying factors that hinder this bringing in players that are not yet convinced, that are need to see the value behind what's responsible sourcing? And what are the big ideas that actually could change that perception, or could change the kind of nuts and bolts that give us this perception of how things work in responsible sourcing agenda? And that's it really from my side, to really kind of give a bit of idea and stimulus for the discussion in the panel discussion later on. And it's back to you, Peter, and thank you for giving us the room, for giving a bit of an overview.
Okay, Andy, thank you very much. And I don't envy you the challenge of synthesizing all the comments and the discussions that have taken place over the last day and a half. There's a really a rich source to be mined in a responsible fashion from you. Just before I turn to my panel for some final discussion, I've just got a couple more polling questions that I'd just like to have a go with. So just a reminder, if you go on to push the chat button at the bottom of the screen, and then go on to push the link, which is just about to come up. In fact, it is there. Please follow this link for the polling. And then I just got two questions that might give us just some interesting insights on how people are feeling at this moment of time. First of all, what is the realistic prospect for achieving a meaningful global transformation towards responsible sourcing? It's that time of the afternoon in the coming decade. So the thinking behind this is that we have big challenges. One that's an elephant sitting in the room is the whole issue of climate change. We are set on a target for a massive transition to net zero carbon. That's on a time scale and urgency. And what I'm interested to hear from those on the line is that realistic prospect for achieving a meaningful global transformation towards responsible sourcing in the coming decade. And I guess I'd like you to put on the scale there from no chance, we're just way out of it, to yeah, it'll definitely happen. We've got real momentum taking place here. Responsible sourcing is going to be the essential part of doing business. It's how we do business. So I'd just like to give you a minute or so to think where on that line about that realistic prospect for achieving a meaningful global transformation towards responsible sourcing in the coming decade. What's your assessment of that? So again, for those who are still navigating their way through, you go to the chat button at the bottom. That throws up the link to the polling question. And then we're off and away. Okay, I'm going to see what the response is. So if we could have the answers. So there we are. 6.1. So that's saying, yeah, we have some real prospect of doing that. We've got a long way to go, but certainly we're beyond no hope. There is prospect out there. So that's quite interesting, and our panelists might want to reflect on that. Maybe some would say we have to achieve global transformation towards responsible sourcing in the coming decade if we have any chance of having a meaningful quality of life on this planet for all people. Okay, I'm going to move to the second question. And a lot of the conversation is between the role of society, politics, policymakers, and the role of businesses themselves in responsible sourcing. So it's a crude question, but which sector offers the greatest prospect for delivering a meaningful shift towards responsible sourcing? So is it the public sector through governments, international, national, regional, European, etc.? Is it the business sector or is it other? I realize that everybody has a role, but if you were to say particularly which sector offers the greatest prospect for delivering that shift, which would it be? Okay, so once again, if we could have the result on that one. So that's interesting. And again, that might come out through the conversation we're about to have. But strong from this small grouping, strong push towards society needs to define the playing field that works in the interests of people. And that is the key, should be the greatest area to deliver this meaningful shift. So we hold on that. That is quite interesting. And what I'd like to do now is to turn to my panel. And I think we've got one or two late changes. I feel we're moving from the dinner party, maybe beyond the washing up, to the after dinner coffee discussion. So I'd like to just introduce our panel. And I think others will tell me because I think we've got a couple of people who at late notice are not able to join us. But first of all, delighted we're joined by Mafraya. Sorry, excuse me for a moment. I'm finding the right page. So many things going on here. Maria Nyberg, who's from the DG for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs. And Maria, great to have you with us. I know you're working mainly in the energy efficiency industries and the DG Grow Raw Materials unit, and responsible for policy on sustainability and secondary raw materials. So great to have you with us. We also have Tyler Gillard back with us, I think. Oh no, Tyler is not with us, forgive me. We've got Rebecca Burton from IRMA, who was in an earlier panel. Also Sarah Blackwell, and finally Masuma is rejoining us, having organized the dinner party and done all the cooking, with joining us back for that final conversation we're going to have. So what I really want to do is to take a little bit of conversation forward. I know not everybody has followed all parts of the conference, but I hope it'll be able to offer us some key reflections. And I wonder, Mafraya, if I come to you first, because you're new to the conversation. Others have followed it through during the day and a half. I'm just interested in maybe a couple of your reflections on maybe where we're at and maybe the biggest prospect for achieving that further meaningful shift towards responsible sourcing, and where you might see that maybe the biggest barriers to us making progress. So over to you just for a couple of initial comments.
Thank you, Peter. Can you hear me well?
It's good.
So happy to join at this last moment of this exchange. It's been really fascinating day and a half for me to follow this from the Commission side. So just to refer to that, responsible sourcing and responsible mining, it's an integral part of the EU raw material strategy. And I believe that it is clear to everyone that the discussions yesterday and today have really shown that responsible sourcing and due diligence, it's growing in importance throughout the raw materials value chain, becoming something of a new normal, something of a new business reality. I just like to take a little bit a helicopter perspective, looking a little bit at the resourcing project, which is an investment through Horizon 2020 and projects in which we take a great interest and have the pleasure of following closely. So ultimately, the resourcing project, it is about feeding into the securing access of sustainable resources, which are key for the EU economy in delivering on the Green Deal. On this theme, we published a communication in September last year. It contains the 2020 list of critical raw materials. And we are also suggesting some 10 actions to reduce the criticality on a number of raw materials. It is about strengthening our open strategic autonomy. And in this communication, we suggest to pool efforts of companies, subnational and national authorities, and EU institutions in some different key areas. It's about developing resilient value chains for EU industrial ecosystems. It's about reducing dependency on primary critical raw materials, item that came up in the discussions yesterday, through promotion of circular use of resources, of sustainable products and innovation. It's about strengthening sustainable and responsible domestic sourcing and processing from within the EU. And it is about diversifying supply with sustainable and responsible sourcing from third countries. It's about strengthening the rules-based open trade in raw materials and about removing distortions to international trades. And Action 10 in our 2020 Critical Raw Materials Action Plan, it is about promoting responsible mining practices for critical raw materials through regulatory initiatives and by joining forces with international partners. And I like to mention here as an example of these kind of regulatory initiatives, our new regulatory framework for batteries that we proposed a couple of weeks ago in December last year, in which we make clear that sustainable and ethical sourcing of raw materials will need to be demonstrated, and transparency and accountability will be required. This proposal now takes its further steps in the process with the co-legislators. That is a little bit trying to bring to see how the resourcing project, how it fits into the overall EU raw materials policy, what our main priorities in that area are. And I can only say as a conclusion that not only in the proposal for the new regulatory framework for sustainable batteries, but also in the proposal that was mentioned by our colleague from DG Just yesterday on the corporate social, on that proposal, and the sustainable finance framework. So it is really the political winds are blowing into the right direction at the moment. That is what I can see.
Maria, I love the analogy of the political winds blowing in a positive direction. And it's very interesting to see some of these initiatives coming through the European Commission. If you had a moment of pause and feeling that maybe the winds are not quite blowing as fast and as forcefully as they could, just wondering if you have a hesitation or a sense of a barrier, something that's still holding back real progress on these types of agendas. What would you highlight?
Well, perhaps a little bit something of a reflection that came up in the excellent session that was managed by you, Masuma, just now. The risk of that we keep preaching for the already believing ones, that we kind of stick into the cocon of those that are already convinced. Whereas yesterday, I believe when we had in the advocacy session, we had the voices from local communities coming up, which take where many take a different view, and well, it is not it's nothing revolutionary, but really to maintain the dialogue, no matter how far away we seem to be. I think it is crucial, and I welcome the efforts within the resourcing projects in that direction.
Right.
And when we talk about raw materials, one aspect that we cannot look aside from is that when we talk about primary sourcing, is that the raw materials, they are located where they are, and that is a fact. So in any case, that is something that we need to relate to. But I would stress the need for to maintain dialogue with the different stakeholders throughout.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Rebecca, come to you from from IRMA. You're obviously steeped in this area. If you were sensing, okay, where could we really push some further effort to get further impetus? Would you highlight anything in particular? And also, if there's a barrier that is dragging us backwards or not as far forward as we should do, that we might actually focus on, what might you highlight?
Sure. The answers are very related. So what pushes us forward? Again, we're a voluntary standard, so it's the market. And I'll just speak to that a little bit more. I mean, the market ultimately asking for responsible sourcing. And by doing that in a way, so we talk about policy and the fact that then if you put something into policy, a company has to meet it. Similarly, if you put into a contract that a supplier has to meet that has to go through a certain standard or be certified against a certain standard, then there's teeth behind it. And so there is a powerful market push. Some of our members, for example, BMW and Mercedes, have both actually said, we're going to put into our contracting the requirement for IRMA. And so through the contract, you bring to the table suppliers who might otherwise not enter. And so I would just say where I see a lot of power is the market push, and also because there's so much nimbleness sort of in the market, right? There's a lot of, it can move sometimes quicker than other players in this space. And the only other thing that I wanted also to touch on that came up in our session was, do we need to offer higher prices for mines that are operating responsibly? And I think there can be a discussion to have there, but we also hear from mining companies, maybe it's not necessarily that we're getting more money for the goods when we operate responsibly, but it could be that we're just getting contracts with suppliers that we want to have relationships with. With purchasers that we as suppliers want to have relationships with, because we know that companies that are managing their ESG factors responsibly are often also managing their business well. And so you as a supplier want to have relationships with those companies, right? Because that long-term contract then becomes very valuable to you. So that's what I would say in terms of what I see as a positive and a strong lever. And then sort of relatedly, I think one of the barriers that we see is just all of the different levels in the supply chain. So how do you make the connections if the market and if the purchasers are really going to drive what happens all the way back at the mine? How do you make all of the connections all the way through? And I would say that's a big hurdle that we're still facing. And I think Bryce spoke to that really well, actually, in our session from Wine Cobalt.
Rebecca, thank you very much. Same question to you, Sarah, if I might, from the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights. You were in the session talking specifically about finance, but if you were to go up in your electric-powered helicopter and just have a broader view of where the real prospects for further momentum on the responsible sourcing agenda might be, but also what the biggest anchor, the barrier to moving us forwards were, what would you offer into the pot?
Sorry, muted.
We should be able to, it suggests you're not muted, but we can't hear you, so still challenged. That's a first when I've seen that there's no mute.
How about now?
That's perfect. Wonderful.
Okay. I think it's an ear pod issue. Okay, great. So you can hear me now. So thanks, Peter. And for those who weren't in the last session, so I'm an advisor to the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and we're now taking on this next decade project. So thinking very much around these two key questions. What are the prospects going forward in the next decade on responsible sourcing, but really broadly speaking, responsible business activity, and what are key barriers? So really pertinent and timely question. So on the prospects side, I would say three key buckets. The movement we're seeing, and I'm biased because I was just in the last session on rewiring finance and getting the full financial ecosystem at the table, recognizing that even if we're getting various, multinational enterprises to small and medium enterprises moving forward, if those that are financing their activities aren't on board and using their leverage in ways that progress responsible activity, then we're really taking one step forward and many steps back. So getting financial actors at the table, getting the others at the table to understand financial incentives, language, relationships, is something that we have capacity building to do around, but we're seeing really promising movement there. Secondly, I would say the smart mix. So this is something that the guiding principles talks about in the OECD guidelines. I see Tyler has joined us, which is great. Really reinforces this idea that we need to drive mandatory measures as much as we do voluntary measures. So the regulatory developments that we're seeing at the EU level, really promising on sustainable finance to human rights due diligence, that driving regulatory developments in other markets as well. And when we have large firms that have services or products in the European market, that trickles down even here, like for instance, in the United States where I'm based. And then promising third bucket for me is the next generation. So thinking about not just millennial investors who are due to invest the bulk of wealth and really prioritizing sustainability, social, environmental, governance issues, but employees in thinking through the greatest talent in across sectors, them really wanting to put their work towards responsible business activity, and even the next business leaders. I'm a lawyer by training, and there was always kind of human rights courses there, but we're seeing more and more business schools putting in place courses, driving leadership models around responsible business activity. And then on the barrier side of things, I would say trying not to reinvent the wheel. So we have things like the UN Guiding Principles, OECD guidelines have very clear human rights standards on the S side of things that also relate to environmental governance issues, key criteria there, key due diligence steps, making sure that we're embedding these standards that are already in existence into all of those other developments that are happening. Core gap is data. We just don't have enough meaningful and robust data, especially on outcomes for people. So we really need data service providers to step up. We need those that use that data to use their leverage in pushing for more meaningful data that drives towards behavior change, corporate culture change, and outcomes for people. And then lastly, I'll finish up here on remedy. This is in the guiding principles speak. We have a third pillar under the guiding principles on access to remedy. The first being government action, the second business action. And the third pillar is very often referenced as the forgotten pillar. Not enough focus on when harms do occur, because they will, no matter how good our policies are, governance systems are, embedding, assessment, prioritization. Harm will happen. So what do we do when that does occur? What types of legal liability regimes do we have in place to ensure that affected rights holders are given meaningful and effective remedy as much as possible? Lots to do in that area. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's quite a menu, but really interesting. Tyler, great to have you with us again. You were with us in the policy and standards discussion earlier, and lovely to have you back. Really, just to draw those one or two of those bigger picture thoughts as we move forward, and really discussing about, okay, well, given that we all seem to have a shared sense of needing to increase and deepen momentum and impact within responsible sourcing, if you see the greatest prospect for how we increase the intensity of activity with impact in this area, and also maybe the things that are holding us back most, what would your offering into the space be?
Thank you, Peter, and apologies to my fellow panelists for being a little bit late. It's great to see, though, some of you again. Well, I think a lot has been said. It's very difficult to come at the end of these things. So many smart people in the discussions. But maybe I would take away three big observations on my side that connect with a lot of what's been said. I mean, the first is, sadly, it's money. It's this issue that we got into our panel, and it sounds like also the previous is, is responsible sourcing being valued by the market, and how are costs going to be shared along supply chains in an equitable way? I mean, I think actually the sharing of costs is one side of the money equation. I mean, we want to improve conditions of work. We want to pay people more. We want to reduce our impact environment. That costs money. Someone's going to need to pay for that. So one option is, of course, we need to agree on models for sharing costs equitably and figuring out who pitches in which aspect of the supply chain, who's paying for what. There have been ideas around polluter pays principles that I saw in the chat, but there's also other types of cost sharing models, tariffs at choke points, et cetera, that I think we need to agree on. That's one, money. But other than sharing costs, another way to bring money is obviously to talk about access to responsible finance. And in a lot of, particularly when we're talking about small and medium-sized enterprises in the middle of that chain. So, entities that might be exporters of ores or traders of metals, they may not be in places where access to finance is available at competitive rates. And if it's 18% interest on my loan to access finance for a trade, well, I'm never going to be able to take out that loan. That is just prohibitive for me. I'm never going to be able to invest in my supply chain because I just don't have a bank that will pony up. And commodities in general is a very high risk for banks. They have to have a lot of capital requirements on the books. So banks in developing countries just don't have that. And I think we need to think about the money equation and really focus on it. How do we share costs, but how do we also increase access to finance and also just lower the costs of doing business in some of these regions? So that would be the first observation is money. Unfortunately, it's something that we really need to be focused on. Someone's got to pay for improvement in the world, right? And whether it's consumers, whether it's the middle of the chain, whether it's banks, whether it's we reduce costs, someone needs to pay for it. And I don't think we're talking about that enough, to be honest. Well, those conversations are happening, like in blended finance, the sustainable development sphere, but we're not connecting them. And I think that's my second observation. So money is the first. Second is the connecting tissue. And I feel like we are missing some of that. And we heard Rebecca make reference to, we need that connecting tissue, not only within the supply chain, so miners, processors, consumers, but also between the policy communities here. I mean, as a policymaker, I'm constantly talking to different policy communities because where is responsible sourcing sit? Is it the mines ministry? Is it development ministry? Is it finance? Is it economy? Is it trade? Well, it's kind of everybody. But as we know, when responsibilities are diffuse, it's no one's responsibility. And that's the same thing in government. And I think we are not doing well enough in connecting law enforcement, so customs, financial intelligence units, with the policy people and the trade people, with the trade enforcement people. And there's this ecosystem and within the supply chain. So the connecting tissue is, I feel like, really what's missing in this debate, particularly because metals and responsible sourcing touches on so many policy areas across so many jurisdictions. And we need to organize competitors, not just within one metal, but across different metals for different downstream industries. So it is a bit of a Herculean task. And that's something we, I think, try to do a little bit, is connect those people. And I guess my third observation is, what mechanisms then do we have in place to look at the money question, to look at the connecting tissue question? Forums like this, I think, are super important. And I think hopefully, what we can do is build learnings from this forum into other forums. And I'll give a little pitch. We do have the OECD forum on mineral supply chains the first week of April. And hopefully I'd love to work with the organizers and think about how do we take some of these learnings and actually move the discussion forward. So we're not just having these one-off discussions over and over. So we need the mechanisms for thinking about the money question and the connecting tissue, but we also need the data. That's part of the mechanisms. I agree completely with Sarah. In order to understand these issues, we need to have good data. And I don't think we're also, when we started our journey at the OECD, we had already started by, collecting data and developing a baseline, but we're only doing that now, I have to say, 8-9 years later. And we're making progress in understanding the uptake and the impact, but it's still very early days. So we need to get that data question. That's part of the mechanism in order to make it all work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some significant thoughts there. Masuma, I might just bring you in, whether you want to just add anything in at this stage to that conversation about where those real prospects for getting that more meaningful shift from what you've heard over the day and a half and your work with Minor Hut. Anything you'd like to add into the pot at this stage?
Okay, I'm going to give a metaphor-heavy comment, and I ask for forgiveness for this, but that's the best way I can visualize this. In the 2 days, we've looked at 4 little fountains. One was advocacy, one was regulations, one was business, and one was finance. And what we've discovered is that those fountains are all gurgling. There's stuff at the bottom, it's starting to rise. But the one thing that was very clear is those fountains are not interconnecting. There's a little bit of spillover between the 4 segments that we were talking about, but these 4 silos are not actually talking to each other. Occasionally we get a little spillover effect, but it's not happening. And so we set the basis. We've found our fountains, we put our water in, and it's coming out. Great. We've got all these creative ideas. But my concern is, in lockdown language, whether we're getting stuck in our support bubbles, whether we're actually just saying, okay, no, I'm only going to talk to people who understand the language that I speak. I don't have time to look at other people, because there is enough going within the silos. So one of my greatest barriers right now, Peter, is, are we talking enough on the top level? Yes, work still needs to be done within each of these silos, but are we missing out on that cross-sectoral knowledge that has now been generated within the responsible sourcing world. When I did my studies years and decades ago, responsible sourcing was not a term we used in development studies. Now you can't get away without using that word. So my concern is we have knowledge at the bottom. It is starting to gurgle up, but unless we make a conscious effort to now get into cross-sectoral silo learning, we're not going to get anywhere.
Right.
My second question, sorry, just very quickly, let's not reinvent the wheel, but maybe we need to change the wheel. We're getting onto rocky grounds. We're getting onto slippery, snow-covered roads now. I am all for, God, please, not another standard in the world. But I am concerned about, especially with COVID and what the global economy is going to go through in the next couple of years, we may need to change our wheel and how we operate and how we get all the aspects of responsible sourcing going, because it is definitely a rocky road ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I wonder whether I could come out and anyone at any point, if you want to react to what you've heard from the others, just wave a hand. But Maria, I'd like to bring you in. Working in the Commission, you're in a world full of silos with lots of rhetoric about silo busting. And we've obviously got the Green Deal is a way of almost having a strategic opportunity. And I just wonder whether you've got an observation and maybe hope about that way of, as Tyler put it, it's the connecting tissue, because you may feel you are in one of those silos. Do you have any insights about how we might be able to make some of those cross connections in a more effective way and possibly push this agenda to a higher level as well of commitment?
One small mini input into that is a proposal you mentioned, Tyler, an upcoming event in a couple of weeks' time that you are setting up. I would like to refer to, at the end of the year, in November, the annual Raw Materials Week. It will be between the 15th and 19th preliminarily. I think it would be a good occasion for reaching out broadly to the raw materials community. We have some 2,000 plus people joining this event. I think that would be a good moment to liaise and to create connections. But other than that, I'm not sure I'm sharing this silo view from the Commission. Actually, things are changing, and the Green Deal, it is really, bringing all of us under this strategy. It is really the growth strategy of the whole of the EU. So I'm not really sharing the silo view. And another remark is that I think that we talk about the millennials and the next generation. I think that we need to come up with new pictures, because I don't think that my children who are 20 and 22, they don't even understand what a silo is. And by the way, it's not used anymore because you have other methods of processing the hay. Anyway, so we need new pictures for the next generations, and the silo. I think that the Green Deal is one major step moving away from the silo perspective, and also the fact that we see proposals relating to due diligence and sustainability from different sides of the Commission. It is from the DG Justice side, from the environmental side, from the industry policy side, from the financial market side. I think that it emerges from different areas. It's a collective effort, really.
Okay, I'd like to bring others in as you feel the impetus. Particularly, I think I'm building on something a couple of things that Tyler said. One was that the infrastructure to actually take this forward requires thought and resourcing. All good dialogue processes take time and resources, and particularly that connecting tissue is often connecting in ways that haven't been connected before. And I'm just intrigued as to whether people feel that there is prospect for an injection of will and resources to create some of that connecting tissue, but also to resource this whole area more. I think we heard in one of the previous panels, someone said, it's all great having standards and all this stuff, but it's actually delivery on the ground that counts, and it's being able to monitor that and assess that really makes the difference. So I'm just wondering whether this is there's a huge potential here, but this is almost a resource-starved area that's only allowing us to make limited progress. Does anyone want to comment on that? Masuma.
Putting on my Mindhunter hat for a moment. Some of the concepts that we talk about in responsible sourcing are not new. Labor laws, environmental laws, social governance laws, these have existed for 20, 30 years. Some of them are really high spec, some of them are not. And I think the issue is capacity there. And we seem to have sort of let governments off, and by governments, I mean all across the world. We seem to have let governments off from this responsibility of enforcing the laws that they themselves have. And that for me is an area we need to come back to. In our conversation about advocacy and local communities, both the community representatives were talking about areas where governments have signed off on mining licenses without consulting their own communities. And we were saying, well, it's something the mining company now needs to deal with. And I sort of want to come back to that and say, hold on, what happened to government responsibilities? Because some of the principles of responsible sourcing are already enshrined in law. Child labor is enshrined in law. So I would love to hear how people think resources are going back to governments and saying, do the job that people elected you for. Is that too old a concept for us to be bringing back in at this stage?
Would someone like to comment on that? I wonder, Sarah, I mean, you have a fascinating overview seeing what's happening in many nations around the world. And do you want to respond to that?
Sure. I mean, I think in answer to your original question, Peter, my mind immediately went to compliance and regulatory requirements that then ostensibly drive better resourcing of these as priority issue areas. But I think Masuma's point is really key. We have health and safety, environmental regulations that have been there, but we haven't gotten to where we need to go. So enforcement being a critical area that governments need to really focus on. I mean, this is where the guiding principles play such an important role in having that first pillar be around the state duty to protect against business-related human rights harms. And of course, it's not an either or, if governments are not fulfilling that duty, businesses still need to step up and be fulfilling their responsibilities. But governments thinking of themselves not only as regulators of companies, but business actors themselves. So I think Masuma is getting to this point quite a bit in government contracts, in development finance, all of these ways in which they themselves are key economic actors and how they need to be practicing what they preach. So from the working group sort of landscape across the board, honing in on these areas on policy coherence, but trade, investment agreements, areas that governments really need to practice what they preach.
Right. I suppose it's interesting as to whether at this stage our politics and particularly our global politics is kind of in a state of not a mess, but we're quite challenged trying to get any great agreements, and our friends in America have in which we've always looked for great leadership, have made things maybe a little more confusing, maybe just in the short term. But the backcloth is not an easy one for really trying to encourage government to step up to the plate further. Maria, you wanted to come in on this one.
Yes, please. Sorry, just wondering, do you have any ideas on you highlighted the need for the better data Any ideas on how to make that happen? Any ideas to improve that?
Anyone got a, Tyler?
I mean, perhaps not from a global level, but one thing I think that we're doing at the OECD is we're trying to create, and we'll actually be releasing it for a public consultation quite soon, a monitoring and evaluation framework, not that necessarily that we would use, but also that everybody would try to use, so that we're all speaking the same language. We've been working on this for about 18 months with support from the EU as well. And it's been with a group of academics and experts that have developed it. And it's been a long time coming, and it looks at indicators and like a theory of change from all the way from buying all the way to the mine and back up. So it's not going to be perfect, but that's at least it's a very concrete project that we are working on. It's intended to be globally used and applied, and everyone can input into it. So that's the whole idea. It will eventually be an open source thing online. So that's one idea, but I mean, I'm sure others on the panel probably have good ideas as well.
Masuma, did you want to come in? Yeah.
Towards that, I think before data collection, the glossary definition is much more important. And this is something Andy was talking about in the last panel, and I think Bernard's talked about it in the business alliances, defining what you're measuring. So everybody agrees to that definition, which is producing a glossary. And I think the EU non-financial directive and sustainable finance task forces are already working on defining that glossary. And I think that's going to be an important bit of saying we all agree on what we are measuring. And then it's about collecting and making it publicly available. Tyler, I don't know how much of your efforts are overlapping with these other glossaries being made in other projects.
We do start with a glossary. We spent about almost a year on that with the team. And there's a number of, I mean, those that are on the call or here might be participating in that process already, but I'm happy to liaise with everybody on this forum and provide info on that.
Right. I just want to move us on a little bit as we draw towards the close. I just wondered, it feels to me that there is a seismic shifts going on out there in the world. We only have to look at climate change. We only have to look at the science that is saying we've basically got 10 years to really turn around the direction that we are going. World Resources Forum throwing out all sorts of issues about our unsustainable use of resources, etc. Every sort of metric seems to be shouting that we are in a crisis, and then you've got a whole set of human issues, social issues about inequality, poverty, all the rest of it. And this is feeling suddenly much more urgent. And I'm just wondering, I'm hearing from all the sessions and this discussions, things we can do when we make progress, and that's great. I just wondered out there, is there any need for a big idea, something that really captures collective imagination and impetus to move forward? Or is the model, we're doing lots of different things, let's get on with it, we're fine, we'll make the connections. I just wondered whether there is an appetite for some sort of a real kind of seismic changing big idea in this sphere that might galvanize us forward. Who's got a big idea? Tyler, give me a
Sorry, Peter, I was going to say that I'm sorry to respectfully probably disagree a little bit. I think we have a tendency to try to latch on to new ideas all the time. It's more interesting and curious and kind of fun.
Yeah.
But I think what we're lacking is delivering on the ideas we've already made, actually. And I think there's a lot of good ideas out there, but getting, rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty to put it into place and, is much harder than coming up with the idea. I know there's been discussion earlier, for example, about, blockchain technology is a perfect example. Like in theory, blockchain could be a really transformative technology for the supply chain and providing information and reducing the costs. But in order to actually implement it with credible information coming in and coming out, you still need boots on the ground. You still need all that ecosystem that is just not in place. So the technology is going to be limited by the fact that the implementing on the ground is not happening. So sorry, the big idea is implement. Like, let's just keep focused on it. Let's not be deterred by all the challenges, because let me tell you, 10 years ago, we were way further away on this discussion. I know people, we can criticize and say the guidances or the benchmarks are not bad enough and they should be, that's fine. But 10 years ago, people weren't even, companies particularly, weren't even accepting they had a real responsibility to address this. So we have made huge progress. And I think we just need to keep our eye on the ball there. Sorry, it's not as exciting. There's no right idea, but I feel like that's the reality a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy. What I want is ambition linked with reality, and if we know exactly what we're doing, we just got to get on and do it. Then that's an important message. Does anyone want to add anything else? Yeah, Rebecca.
Yeah, I would just echo. I think the idea of there is a possibility for distraction, right, from the work that needs to get done. If you're really focused on a big idea, you can actually distract from the fundamental issues that are there. I mean, so if you look at the issues that are related to mining, they've actually been the same issues really since mining has happened, right? In terms of waste disposal, water management, all types of, basically you can have a standard because it's not as though there's always fluctuation in what's happening at the mine site, right? We know what the issues are. We know what issues need to be addressed. And so it's actually coming in and saying, let's work on addressing all of the issues, not just the risk of the year that's sort of brought to the forefront by some disaster, but let's actually look at the full suite of risks, the full suite of challenges that come along with this extractive sector, and let's work on each one as we can to ultimately address them and have that rising tide where sort of all of the challenges and all of the issues are addressed, not just in piecemeal or not just with one big idea.
Yeah. Sarah, Maria, do you want to respond as well? Sarah.
Sure. So I just completely agree with Tyler, not surprisingly. And I think back to, Masuma, your earlier point about a new wheel being needed. Just to connect these points, I think we've had the wheel, as Tyler is saying, but we haven't been using it. So we've been distracted by maybe some other wheels that are going on. But I think rather than a big idea, we have the big experience now that we've had in this current COVID crisis, sort of global campaign that's long overdue around racism and discrimination. There are all these different crises, the climate crisis that are happening. And it's just laying bare the fragility of the existing, economic systems. And it's very clear now that these were all built on very fragile ground, and that we need to reinforce what we've had in place. So that's, I think just the last reflection I would have. Maybe big idea, if I had to maybe throw one out there, is just to put workers on every corporate board. That would be a great experiment, and would love to see what comes of that.
Okay, Masuma, do you want to? Yeah.
I think it's time here's my impression. And I know this is partly not true, but the impression is we have the big idea in the EU 27. And it's about time you took it for a test road show into the rest of the world. And I know the OECD and IRMA have immense third country consultations, but there is so much of what we've talked about here that has been missing that element of, let's take it to third world countries. Sorry, my development economist professor is going to hit me on that one. Developing countries, we need to have this big idea agreed upon. And I don't think we're there yet.
And I suppose, Maria, you might say that, looking from European perspective, the Green Deal is a big idea into which a lot of this activity fits. So we want a green transition, but we want it to be fair and sustainable. So maybe that's the hook and the drive upon which we can hang a lot of this activity.
I would say that, yes.
Great, fantastic. Just in the last part, and I'm don't feel any disappointment that you haven't come up with great new big ideas, because I was kind of partly thinking that we just need to roll our sleeves up and get on and doing some of this stuff. I'd like to bring Andy in, if I can, Andy Endel. because you're part of the team that's nudging the resourcing project forward. And just the last few moments, I'd like a reflection from everything that's been said and some really great thoughts coming out of this last session. If we were to reflect back on the progress of the resourcing initiative, the 3-4 years of resource to create platforms for conversations, etc. And this may be a moment of reflection to think, okay, maybe we need to put more emphasis in a particular area. What I think I'll start with is just seeing if any of our panel would like to offer a thought about if they had a chance to tweak resourcing as a program. What would you throw in as being something it might emphasize that it's not? And then I'll use Andy as my test. He'll say, oh, we're already doing that, or that's very interesting. So I just wonder initially whether someone would like to come. You may not know that much about resourcing, but if you had a pot of European money to take this platform of conversation forward, what would you be critically hoping that it might actually achieve that is fresh and useful and fills a gap? Tyler, you're never short of an idea.
Or non-ideas.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of these platforms out there in the connecting tissue. So, I mean, we would love to see consensus-built recommendations to us on how we could improve our work and connect more with you. So, I mean, it's not brilliant, but, if resourcing were to build a consensus of saying, look, we would love the OECD to connect with the EU here and the EU to be different. I think someone needs to try to take that 30,000 view and build consensus around actions that different parties can take to integrate and build those synergies. And I think sometimes we try to play the role of the OECD, but as you know, we have sometimes different focus. We're a different political body as well. We have different membership. So maybe the resourcing panel is the place to do it. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm going to immediately, you can either, like the wisdom of Solomon, you can sort of nod your head, Andy, or you might just want to, well, say a few words of encouraging reaction to what you've heard from Tyler.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. I think I made that point clear at the very beginning in my presentation last day. Nobody remembers probably that we are kind of, the knit and the facilitator for a lot of players in this regard, and players actually who really have the resources to catalyzing change. And in that sense, we are already connecting to a lot of European Commission agencies. We are reaching out to international players such as the OECD to really make the actions, what we're doing, really very much in your action program and supporting the work that happens therein. And I think this is the way forward for us to really be influential, because we ourselves, we cannot do that, but really to kind of galvanize change in these organizations and support you on your work in this regard.
Okay, great. Rebecca.
So I would actually echo Masuma here in terms of how do we actually take and test this in the places where extraction is happening. And Andy, to your point about just saying you're here in terms of facilitating and being the connective tissue of the players that can make a change, what I would say is over the next 3 years, can you bring in more of those voices from outside Europe, where the mining is actually happening, where the sourcing is actually happening, so that the conversation then really does bring in what we've been emphasizing this whole time, the multi-stakeholderism. I think that would be something really important to see. And the speaker lineup yesterday with the communities, for example, was really fantastic. To see them continue in the conversation would be really important.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that. Bravo. Yeah, I think we were trying to really this balanced view of stakeholders in the sense of things we are usually missing out, that resourcing is the place to be. But I think most importantly, and we've touched upon this issue many times, that we are the kind of preachers who say we need to do things, but resourcing is also, I think, the platform for especially market players to make them aware that there is an agenda on responsible sourcing, that there is a place to be and a place to where we see value in the discussion, also value for new business models to also take on. And I think that is particularly a field we would like to concentrate on, bringing other market players on board and seeing what's the value for responsible sourcing.
Okay, and maybe it's interesting if we looked at some of the panels and the conversations, if you'd randomly shaken up the pack, so it wasn't all the finance people discussing finance or all the front runners discussing front runners, but we actually mixed it up, might have had some quite interesting outcomes. So maybe there's a creativity of process approach that we tend to go to the experts who reinforce the expert view, valid though that is. How do we shake it up, and also shake it up so that some people have huge amounts of knowledge about some things, some less, but they are a very, very valid voice. So how do we create the space where we don't have experts dominating, but actually a small voice with a big impact is able to have a thoughtful conversation? So that's maybe one for moving us forward. Other thoughts, Sarah? I just come across you, whether you from the other side of the pond, whether you think this strange little project happening in Europe resourcing, what would you pump a thought into how it might be a sparkling jewel over the next 4 years?
Sure, that's a good cue. So I would say having those outside of the European context, which might be the starting point in terms of where movement's happening, as part of the discussion and talking about, how the action happening in a certain region affects their day-to-day work. And that's with civil society groups as much as government actors, which maybe the past 4 years or so haven't been at the table. Hopefully now will be coming to the table more and more. Investors, academics, even, making sure that implications for other regions, even those in global north countries, are at the table. And then, this won't be surprising given my participation in the last session, but just really making sure that the conversation is around the full value chain. So an observation that I've had in a lot of these discussions around responsible sourcing is there's so much talk of supply chain. And while that is such a focal point and needs to be in terms of severity of, human rights harms, we really do need to be looking across the full value chain and pushing regulatory regimes to have a scope that includes, financial actors in particular, and making sure that they're held accountable for their actions.
Great. Maria, anything? I mean, the European Commission through Horizon 2020 has been funding this, is funding resourcing. Whether you just have an observation about the journey forwards. Just need to demute.
Yes, so I would just like to give you a good to support the work that you have done so far. I think that I'm impressed with your efforts and energy, and I'm looking forward to continue following your work and to continue talking to you about how to further improve the results and deliveries.
Okay.
So it's been a really good experience for me.
Great. Masuma, do you want to just, I mean, you're part of the sort of coordinating side as well, or have you got a reflection, a self-reflection?
For the rest of you, please be aware that Andy and I talk once a week at least about this project. So most of this communication is ongoing. I think one of the biggest challenges that we as a team, and Andy is the sensible sort of person on this team in so many ways, there is so much to be done, but we have already completed 1 year of this project and we've got 3 years left. We will not be able to do everything. And I think it's that central role that Andy and Alex at the University of Vienna play in keeping us on track and say, do what is doable and do it well, rather than we'll do this, because every other day I'll always go back and say, hey, why can't we do something on this? And I think it's Andy and Alex who keep the rest of us grounded and say, there is a project proposal, there is something we're supposed to do, let's focus on what we can do, because this is an area where there's just so much that one can do. So Andy, keep doing that.
Okay, so maybe do less, do it well. focus. That's really interesting. Okay, we're really right at the end now. As I do, I'm just going to come around all of you. I feel a surge of hope and possibility. There has to be hope, otherwise we might as well just pack up and go home. So I just want literally a one sentence from you, just because I'm exhausted after a day and a half. And I'm quite worried in many respects about some of the things I've heard, and I've seen glimmers of good stuff and all the rest of it. For those of us who've traveled on this journey through this conference and will take us further, if you just had a one-liner really that maybe gave us a final thought or an encouragement, what would that be? Rebecca.
I would say it is possible, and that comes from many years of creating the standard, wondering if a mine would be certified, and it happened. So last year for us against the IRMA standard. So it is possible. It is happening. The sea change is happening.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sarah.
So I would take a token from Tyler and say that, you know, we've accomplished so much in the last 10 years. Look at how far we've come, and then feel hopeful about where we'll go in the next decade.
Yeah, that's stolen your thunder, Tyler. Think of another one.
Sorry, Tyler.
Thank you.
Well, since I would say figure out who's going to pay. I think we've got a lot of the infrastructure in place, and that touches also, now I'll steal from Sarah on her value chain point. We got to bring the banks in, the financiers, but we're on the right path. So I think we shouldn't also be hard on ourselves.
Okay, Maria.
I get back to my wind. Sail as fast and far as you can on the wind that we are seeing right now. We have major developments that were not there when this topic was announced in the call for proposal of Horizon 2020. So make use of that.
Great. Masuma?
More effort to make sure our concepts are not divorced from reality. So on the ground, implement. On the ground, implement.
Brilliant. Well, that's a great after dinner coffee round of discussion, some further thoughts and ideas. I shall be doing a little bit more of the washing up after this, so you as a panel are relieved of all those duties. But if I could thank you all very much for inspiring and thoughtful contributions and grounding us away from too many more big ideas. That's great. Andy, I really like to just turn to you at the end, not for a full reflection on a day and a half journey, but just in terms of how you move forward, and what people are likely to expect coming out from this particular conference, and any other final words that you'd just like to share. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And just for everyone, I was really fascinated by the discussions we had and all the inputs we got. So first of all, a very, very big thank you for the speakers, for the valuable contributions throughout the 1.5 days, for the panel moderators to keep us on time most of times, and for inspiring our discussions during the panels. And I think most important, our technical team, my team, Constance, Noé, Angelo, Jassad, Alex and Heike, for keeping this all running, this infrastructure and this beast of a meeting actually that got into 2 months, 3 months of organization. And I think, Peter, for you, letting us not off the hook in terms of timing and giving us some inspiring ideas for discussion and for keeping us on track on this very dense program during the last 1.5 days. And I think most importantly, to all the people with us, we have drop-in, drop-outs. That's the nature of digital meetings. For all the participants who are chiming in, bringing their ideas, responding to other people on chat, being welcoming to anyone who's on this program or who has been on this program so far. And thanks a lot for being with us. And maybe a brief reflection on follow-up. So everything what we've been discussed will be on the resourcing website in the sense of PowerPoint presentation, the recording, etc. And all participants will be informed in a final thank you email that will come up in the next 3 to 4 days. And if you're more interested in resourcing activities, please get to our homepage, subscribe to our newsletter, go on LinkedIn, follow us on LinkedIn to really be involved with us during the next 3 years. And yeah, we will see it on the chat if it's coming up. And yeah, that's the last thing on us. And I think my final word for this will be fast tracking implementation. Yes, we are there to support any kind of actors in this area, and we try to liaise as good as possible and use the momentum that's currently going on, not only in Europe, but in the rest of the world as well. So that's my final word, and I'd like to go back to Peter for the final closure and your words. Thank you very much, everybody.
Andy, thank you very much. And thank you to you for your Herculean efforts. We are all navigating a new world, not only the constraints of coronavirus, and let us all hope that that will soon be a part of the past and we can move forwards, but also in exploring these new platforms that offer many ways of many advantages in terms of access, but also challenges in terms of real, meaningful human interaction. We're learning as we go, and my thanks also to the team who's silently kept the whole ship on the road. So we are right at an end. I'm sure you can stay for a few moments if you want to for chat. Otherwise, thank you all for your attention and for your engagement over the last day and a half. And no doubt we'll see you and hear from you as we carry the journey further forwards. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, depending on which part of the globe you're from, and stay safe. Thank you very much.